I'm going to be showing you how we slide the finger stitches and the thumb stitches off of our needles where we created them and onto waste yarn to be used for later. So you can see my actual finished mitt here. All of our fingers we're going to create first. We cast on at the top edge and we knit our way down, and then we are going to want to put the live stitches from these fingers and thumb that we created onto waste yarn to be ready to go ahead and start knitting the rest of the body of the mitt. So I have already done the first 4 fingers. The pattern recommends, and I highly recommend, string them onto 2 pieces of waste yarn. So I've got 2 different pieces here. I string half of the stitches onto one piece of string and half of the stitches onto the other piece of string. And I string them on in the order that they're going to go. So I string them on, you cast on fewer stitches for the pinky, and then the ring finger and pointer and middle finger, and then you cast on the most stitches for the thumb, just so that those are in order. You want to make sure when you're knitting your mitt, the fingers that are slightly different sizes go on in the correct order for those sizes. The other thing, and again this is mentioned in the pattern, but I want to point it out here, the other thing that matters, because we've got a stitch pattern going here, you can see how there's one continuous line. We don't have a break in our pattern at our fingers. You want to make sure that when you put these on the waste yarn, you just want to make sure that the last stitch of one finger, if it was a knit stitch, so you can easily tell it's a knit stitch because you've got that letter V. To me it looks just like a letter V, 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 all the way down. So if you've got that knit stitch letter V as the last stitch of one finger, then that knit stitch letter V should be the last stitch of the next finger. So 2 knit stitches together right next to each other. And just make sure that happens all the way across. 2 knit stitches next to each other. And then this has an odd number of stitches. You want to have the purl stitch be right next to the purl stitch of the next one. So as long as they are on your needles that way, and if you get it correct one way, it will be correct the other way. That you've got purl stitch next to purl stitch next to purl stitch, knit stitch next to knit stitch, all the way down. And that is all there is to that. I do want to show you how to actually slide your stitches onto waste yarn here. It is not a hard thing to do at all. You want to take a tapestry needle, thread some waste yarn through it. I highly recommend a waste yarn that is a different color than the main yarn that you are knitting with. You are just going to want to cut your working yarn, or snap it if you're using a wool-based or an animal fiber-based yarn that can be torn that way. You are going to, again, if you're doing the fingers, you want to make sure when you're sliding them on, okay, I'm going to check, it's a knit stitch over here. I want to make sure that this one is a knit stitch. If it's not a knit stitch, if it is a knit stitch like here, okay, I'm ready to go. If it's not a knit stitch, just flip it over to the other side and it will be. You are going to just go ahead and take your tapestry needle threaded with that waste yarn and slide it through all of the stitches on there. I generally will slide it through 2 or 3 stitches. You'll notice I'm putting my tapestry needle in as if to purl to slide those stitches straight across so that they are not twisted. And another thing that you can think about, although it's not a necessity, if you think about how you're actually going to sew these or weave the ends in, weaving an end in, you're always going to have 2 ends for every finger. The cast on end that you'll just weave into the finger itself. And then the end of the finger, you're always going to have this piece of waste yarn, or the tail of yarn that you've got to weave in. If you think about where that thumb is going to meet the body of your mitt, you're more likely to get a little gap and a little hole right there. So if I'm going to pick, which I am, which way I sew my thumb onto my glove, I want the tail that I'm going to weave in to be here to close that little hole, rather than on the outside. There's not going to be a little gap and a little hole right there that I need to close up. So if I get to pick, I want to put them right there. So since I'm just going to thread the thumb onto one needle, I am going to go ahead and make sure that where I tie my knot is going to be the same place where this is, and that's going to be where I slide that needle back again. So I'm going to take my tapestry needle, thread that waist yarn through there, and pass it through this way. And that's just going to put that knot on the same side so that when I'm ready to take my thumb off of the waist yarn and put it back onto my needles to knit it, I'm going to untie and get started putting it back on where the knot is. That just putting that knot where that waist yarn is makes that a little bit, kind of a little extra reminder. You'll actually notice on the fingers you can do the same thing, where you've got a tail of yarn at the bottom each time. So if you sort of arrange it so that the tail can close up the gap between the two fingers, rather than it only really matters on the pinky and the pointer finger, but that this is here to close that up rather than on the outside. So there's one here, there's going to be two here because you have the tail from one finger and from the other finger, and then the same way here, the tail from the pinky is going to be on the inside here to close up that little gap that's always going to happen, rather than on the outside where there's not going to be a gap. That part is not a necessity. There are other ways to do that, but if you happen to think about it, you can kind of play with things and slide just a stitch to one needle or to the other needle to get everything to line up the way you want it to. And that is sliding your stitches onto waist yarn for your 4 fingers and your thumb before it's time to start knitting the rest of your mitt.